Trump just lost control. Canada walks away, and the world takes notes. Stop scrolling. What you are watching right now is not a trade dispute. It's not a negotiation tactic, and it is definitely not art of the deal. This is the moment a sitting U.S. president lost control of a trade war he personally started, and for the first time in modern history, the other side didn't blink. They walked away. Not China, not Mexico, Canada, America's closest ally, its quietest neighbor, the country Washington assumed would always fall in line. That assumption just collapsed, and the consequences are already spreading. The move that started it all on February 1st, 2025, Donald Trump signed a sweeping set of executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on nearly all Canadian imports, with a targeted strike on energy products at 10%. He didn't do this through Congress. He didn't renegotiate a treaty. He invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law meant for wars, terrorism, and national crises, and he used it to override a trade agreement he himself negotiated during his first term. The public justification? Fentanyl. But here's the problem. U.S. Customs data shows virtually none of the fentanyl seized at U.S. borders comes from Canada. The numbers don't support the claim. The intelligence doesn't support the claim. This wasn't about drugs, it was about dominance. Canada's response shocked Washington. Canada didn't protest, they didn't beg, they didn't ask for exemptions, they retaliated immediately. First, $30 billion in counter tariffs, then $155 billion in under 3 weeks, and the targets were not random. Automobiles, steel and aluminum, beef and pork, dairy, household goods, all aimed at U.S. political pressure points, swing states, manufacturing hubs, export-dependent regions. This wasn't emotional, it was surgical. Enter Mark Carney, and everything changed. Then something happened that the White House clearly didn't expect. Canada got a new prime minister. Mark Carney, not a career politician, not a populist, a central banker, former head of Sectionos, the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, the only person in history to run 2 G7 central banks, a man whose entire career is built on understanding leverage, and in his first major address, Carney made something crystal clear: the tariffs would stay. Not until negotiations end, not until a deal is reached. They stay until the United States shows respect. That word mattered, because this was no longer about economics. It was about sovereignty. Trump escalates and makes it worse. Instead of backing down, Trump doubled down. By August, he imposed 35% tariffs on Canadian goods that didn't meet strict origin rules under USMCA. His reasons changed daily. Retaliation, trade deficits, fentanyl. Unfairness. The logic didn't matter anymore. What mattered was pressure. But here's the mistake Trump made, the one that experts say broke the strategy entirely. Canada doesn't just export finished goods. 80% of Canadian exports to the U.S. are intermediate inputs, raw materials, energy components, the things American factories need to function. When you tariff inputs, you don't hurt the exporter first. You hurt your own manufacturers. That's why even the Wall Street Journal, traditionally pro-Republican, called this the dumbest trade war in modern history. The economic damage hit fast by March. The S&P 500 had entered correction territory. Over $4 trillion in market value vanished. After new auto tariffs, another 10% drop in 2 days, the worst market week since 2020. This wasn't market panic. This was investors pricing in reality. Canada did the unthinkable. Trump assumed Canada would crack. Instead, Canada pivoted. On January 16, 2026, Mark Carney landed in Beijing, the first Canadian Prime Minister to do so in nearly a decade, and the deal they announced stunned Washington. Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola slashed. Seafood exports reopened. Agricultural barriers lifted billions in new markets overnight. In exchange, Canada allowed limited Chinese EV imports, and just like that, Canada broke alignment with U.S. trade policy. Trump's response revealed the real agenda. Trump exploded. He threatened 100% tariffs. He accused Canada of becoming a China port. And once again, he didn't call Carney prime minister. He called him governor. Trump has repeatedly referred to Canada as a potential 51st state, posted altered maps, mocked the border, claimed Canada exists because of America. This stopped being trade policy. This became territorial rhetoric, and Carney finally called it out publicly. The Davos moment that changed everything at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Carney delivered a speech that rippled across the globe. He said the era of U.S. economic leadership is over, that the so-called rules-based order was always selective. And then came the line, diplomats won't forget. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Middle powers heard the message, and they're responding. Canada is leaving, not waiting. Canada isn't trying to replace the U.S. overnight. They're doing something smarter. They're making U.S. access non-essential. 12 new trade negotiations. 4 continents, Europe, Asia, Latin America. Exports to Europe up 22%. Africa up 18%. South America up 11%. Not total replacement, enough to break leverage. American workers are feeling it. Ohio, Michigan. Auto manufacturing, refineries built for Canadian crude can't easily switch. Factories stall, costs rise, jobs move, not back to America but elsewhere, Mexico, Europe. Trump promised reindustrialization. Instead, he pushed production away. Even the courts stepped in. Federal courts ruled Trump's tariffs illegal. He ignored them. Canada noticed and quietly stopped playing. They lifted consumer tariffs, kept strategic ones, because they were done negotiating with someone who wasn't negotiating. This is the real story. This isn't about tariffs. It's about loss of control. Trump assumed proximity equals dependence. Canada proved it doesn't. They accepted pain. They diversified. They called the bluff, and once leverage disappears, it doesn't come back. Final thought. The question is no longer, can Canada survive without the U.S.? They already answered that. The real question is, can the U.S. afford to keep pushing allies away? Because supply chains don't reset. Trust doesn't rebound, and dominance isn't automatic. It's conditional, and the world is adjusting. Stop everything. Senate leaders confront Trump in private. A line was drawn. Stop everything. What is unfolding in Washington right now is not routine politics. It is not cable news theater, and it is not just another loud headline that disappears tomorrow. According to multiple sources familiar with events inside the Capitol, senior Senate leaders have just taken an extraordinary step. They confronted Donald Trump face to face, delivering a warning so direct and so unprecedented that it has sent shockwaves through both parties. If these reports are accurate, this moment could mark a turning point, not just for Trump, but for how power is exercised in the United States going forward. This was not a normal meeting. This was not a photo op. There were no cameras, no press statements beforehand, no coordinated messaging afterward. What is being described is a closed-door confrontation triggered by a major legal setback earlier today, a ruling that sharply narrowed Trump's remaining legal defenses related to election interference allegations. Within hours, Senate leadership moved. That alone tells you something important. The Senate does not move quickly unless the situation is considered serious, and it almost never moves together unless the institutional risk is perceived as real. Why this moment matters, reports indicate that figures from both sides of the aisle were involved. That detail matters more than any name. This was not Democrats attacking Trump, and it was not Republicans defending him. This was the political establishment signaling that the rules of engagement have changed. When leaders who normally avoid confrontation decide to intervene directly, it suggests they believe delay is no longer an option. Inside the room, what sources say happened. Sources describe a tense, tightly controlled setting inside a Senate conference space. Staff were reportedly dismissed, phones removed, doors closed. Trump, by all accounts, entered confident, even defiant. But the tone shifted quickly. Senate leaders are said to have delivered a blunt message. The legal landscape has changed. Institutional patience is wearing thin. Continued escalation will trigger consequences that cannot be managed politically. One source summarized it this way: this wasn't advice, it was a warning. At several points, voices reportedly rose. Trump is said to have demanded loyalty. The response, according to insiders, was silence. That silence may be the most telling detail of all. The meaning of silence in Washington. In Washington, silence is not neutrality, it is distance. When allies stop defending you publicly, when statements shift from names to abstractions, when words like process, rule of law, and institutions replace personal support, that is how political insulation disappears. And insulation, once gone, does not come back. This is bigger than Trump. This confrontation was not about personality, it was about containment. Lawmakers are acutely aware of what prolonged instability does. Markets react, allies. Hedge courts accelerate, bureaucracies shift into self-protection mode. At some point, institutions stop negotiating with personalities and start defending themselves. That is what this moment appears to represent. Why now? Why today? Because legal delay has limits. The ruling earlier today, while procedural in nature, reportedly eliminated a key argument Trump's team had relied on to slow enforcement. Once delay becomes ineffective, political calculation changes. Senate leaders understand something crucial. If institutions do not assert boundaries before enforcement accelerates, they risk losing control over the process entirely. What happens? After a moment like this, history shows a clear pattern. Public defenses fade. Private distancing accelerates. Procedural action replaces rhetoric. Expect the following in the coming days: faster oversight activity, more subpoenas, shorter court timelines, less political cover for noncompliance. This is not chaos, it is systems moving deliberately. Trump's likely response. Trump's playbook is well known. Frame events as betrayal. Mobilize supporters, attack institutions, claim persecution. Those tactics are effective in political arenas. They are far less effective inside courtrooms, committees, and enforcement mechanisms. That asymmetry matters. Why this feels different? Because this time, the confrontation was direct. No intermediaries, no press releases, no plausible deniability. When senior leaders choose face-to-face confrontation, it usually means we need this on record. That is not symbolism. That is positioning. Global eyes are watching. International partners monitor moments like this closely. They are not focused on Trump's rhetoric. They are watching whether American institutions can still enforce limits, maintain stability, resolve internal conflict without escalation. Confidence abroad depends on predictability at home, and predictability depends on institutions holding their line. What this moment really is, this is not the end of anything yet, but it may be the end of ambiguity. The era of "we'll see how it plays out" appears to be closing. What follows will be procedural, not theatrical, and that is often when outcomes become unavoidable. Final thought: when political power stops being negotiated and starts being constrained, the tone of history changes. If the reports about today's confrontation are accurate, then a line was drawn, quietly, firmly, and without applause. What happens next will not depend on speeches or rallies. It will depend on compliance. And history shows that when systems decide to move, they move slowly at first, and then all at once. Instead, he pushed production away. Even the courts stepped in. Federal courts ruled Trump's tariffs illegal. He ignored them. Canada noticed and quietly stopped playing. They lifted consumer tariffs, kept strategic ones, because they were done negotiating with someone who wasn't negotiating. This is the real story. This isn't about tariffs, it's about loss of control. Trump assumed proximity equals dependence. Canada proved it doesn't. They accepted pain. They diversified. They called the bluff. And once leverage disappears, it doesn't come back. Final thought. The question is no longer, can Canada survive without the U.S.? They already answered that. The real question is, can the U.S. afford to keep pushing allies away? Because supply chains don't reset, trust doesn't rebound, and dominance isn't automatic, it's conditional, and the world is adjusting. This is one of those rare moments where power quietly shifts behind closed doors, the kind of moment that only becomes obvious after history has already turned. According to multiple accounts circulating among Capitol insiders, senior Senate leaders have just confronted Donald Trump directly in a private, high-stakes meeting that insiders are already calling one of the most tense political encounters in years. If these accounts are accurate, this was not a warning dressed up as conversation. It was not advice. It was not negotiation. It was a boundary being enforced. This was not normal. Senate behavior, to understand why this matters, you have to understand how Washington usually works. The Senate does not move quickly. Leadership does not improvise. And bipartisan coordination almost never happens unless leaders believe something fundamental is at risk. Yet today, following a major legal development that narrowed Trump's remaining legal protections, Senate leadership reportedly convened an emergency closed-door session. No staff, no press, no leaks, at least not initially. When figures who normally operate through intermediaries choose direct confrontation, it signals one thing: they believe delay is more dangerous than conflict. Inside the room, a political pressure cooker sources familiar with the meeting describe a small, controlled space inside the Senate wing. Phones were reportedly excluded, staff were asked to leave, doors were closed. Trump entered with confidence. That part is not surprising. He has survived scandals, investigations, impeachments, and elections that would have ended most political careers. But what followed, according to insiders, was different. Senior Senate figures, including leaders from both parties, spoke plainly. No slogans, no ambiguity. The message was consistent. The legal environment has changed. Institutional tolerance is exhausted. Continued escalation will trigger consequences no one can contain. One source described the tone as final. Why bipartisan matters more than any name. It is easy to focus on personalities, but the real story is alignment. This was not Democrats versus Trump. This was not Republicans defending him. This was the institution itself asserting authority. That distinction matters because institutions don't get emotional. They don't posture. They don't bluff. When institutions move, they do so because they believe self-preservation is at stake. The moment loyalty disappeared. At several points during the meeting, Trump reportedly demanded loyalty from party leaders, from allies, from institutions that once shielded him. The response, according to multiple accounts, was silence. In Washington, silence is not indecision. It is distance. It is the moment when support becomes conditional or disappears entirely. And once that happens, the political terrain changes fast. Why today was different. This confrontation did not happen in a vacuum. It followed a court decision that reportedly removed one of the last procedural barriers Trump's legal team had relied on to delay enforcement. That matters because political strategies built on delay collapse when time runs out. Senate leaders understand this better than anyone. They know that once courts accelerate, political cover becomes irrelevant, and they know that if they do not assert boundaries now, they risk losing control of the process entirely. This was about containment, not punishment. What insiders emphasize is that this meeting was not about revenge or punishment. It was about containment. Lawmakers are deeply aware of what prolonged uncertainty does. Markets destabilize, allies hedge, bureaucracies shift into self-protection. Extremes gain oxygen. At some point, institutions stop negotiating with personalities and start defending the system. That is what today appears to represent. The aftermath is already visible. Within hours of the meeting, patterns began to emerge. Public defenses softened. Statements avoided Trump's name. Language shifted to process and rule of law. Fundraisers quietly paused. Donors hesitated. These are not coincidences. This is how insulation disappears. And once political insulation is gone, legal exposure becomes real. What happens after a moment? Like this, history is clear on what follows moments like these. First comes quiet distancing, then procedural acceleration, then institutional enforcement. Expect to see faster court timelines, more aggressive oversight, less tolerance for defiance, reduced political intervention. This is not chaos. This is bureaucracy doing what it does best, moving slowly, deliberately, and then all at once. Trump's options are narrowing. Trump's traditional tools remain: public rallies, media attacks, framing events as betrayal, mobilizing supporters. Those tools work in politics. They do not work against subpoenas, court orders, and statutory deadlines. This asymmetry is critical. The louder the rhetoric becomes, the quieter the machinery gets, and quiet machinery is the most dangerous kind. Why this feels like a turning point? Because this confrontation was direct. No intermediaries, no plausible deniability, no symbolic gestures. When leaders confront someone face to face, it usually means they want one thing: a record. That record matters legally, institutionally, historically. Global attention is intensifying. International partners pay close attention to moments like this. They are not watching speeches. They are watching whether American institutions can still enforce limits, resolve internal conflict, maintain predictability. Confidence abroad depends on stability at home. And stability depends on institutions holding firm when tested. What this moment really represents: this is not the end of Trump's political influence, but it may be the end of ambiguity. The era of endless delay, endless deflection, and endless political shielding appears to be closing. What comes next will not be decided on social media. It will be decided through compliance or the consequences of refusal. Final thought: history rarely announces itself loudly. More often, it happens quietly, in closed rooms, behind locked doors, when powerful people decide that waiting is no longer an option. If the reports about today's confrontation are accurate, then a line was drawn, not in public, not for applause, but for the record. What happens next will not feel dramatic at first, but when institutions move, they do not reverse. And once that process begins, the outcome becomes less about personalities and more about whether anyone, no matter how powerful, can remain above the system that governs everyone else.